All right. Well, Fox Takes episode with default friend here. We've been talking about this for a while. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I think I really would wanting to get your story on. So for anybody out there who is just discovering who you are on Twitter prolifically, as you said in your Substack conversation yesterday, tweeting upwards of dozens of times a day. We'll put it that way. And you started last year with this mission to be people's friend by default in San Francisco, and it snowballed from there. And so, clearly, as a therapist, I think this is a fascinating subject. So, if you wouldn't mind telling us what brought you to California, what started this mission.
Yeah, so first I want to disclaim I'm no longer doing this. It's actually it's an experiment that like simultaneously makes people like very excited or curious, but also I've gotten quite a few negative responses from it as well. So I started working at a startup. I was at an advertising agency, and I switched industries to tech. And I was going to San Francisco a lot, and either friends I already had there, family I already had there, um, or people I was just meeting would always tell me the Bay Area is a very hard place to make friends, and it is very lonely. And it did not matter who I was hanging out with or what the conversation was. It would happen at work. It would happen, just getting dinner with friends. It was just over and over and over again. And it seemed like people there were very lonely. But I kind of like didn't, I was like skeptical. I was like, there's like, this is not just one major city. It's, all these like satellite towns. There's a lot going on here. There's at least two major universities. There's a vibrant industry, at least one vibrant industry. Even if it's like lame, as people say, there's just no way. Um, so I got divorced and I ended up moving out to California for another job. Um, so I decided that I was going to just hang out with whoever wanted to hang out with me and be like super aggressive about it. And I also had an events list. So my whole thing was just sort of like really, really like being, assertive about, we're going out, we're exploring San Francisco, we are enjoying it, and I will do whatever it is with whoever it is. Um, just to like prove that it's interesting, A, and B, like you can make friends in the Bay Area if you try hard enough. And eventually like it became enough of a thing where it was a net negative, not a net positive. But yeah, I mean that was it, and I made a ton of friends. I just tried very hard to meet people, and it ended up working out. Of course, like a caveat here is like I am like a young single woman, so perhaps that was part of it. But I do think especially with the number of women I ended up meeting through this, like there was like a real like hunger for friendliness.
Right. Okay. I think that's a really good point. I don't know what it is. I lived in Colorado for upwards of 10 years, and I think the further west you go, the more there is a kind of capital S culture society. And I mean, there's a thriving hiking community. I did outdoor stuff in Colorado, and going to college out there it made it easier to significantly make friends. And then banding together, getting to know people who also were passionate about mental health and therapists, whatever. That was pretty fruitful for meeting people. But the different social mechanisms like church and other civic sort of agencies that were the traditional sort of methodologies for setting you up with friend networks. I think the further west you go in many ways, maybe for the further toward the coast you go, right? That might be more accurate. I think there's something to the kind of dissolution of sort of societal coherence or coherence of friend groups. I don't know. Did you kind of experience that?
I think it's like I think that's a good observation. Um, I I kind of want to go a little bit against the grain here. I think like there is less cohesion. There's no there, a lot of cities lack sort of like a common space where people are going over and over again, like the bar that everyone hangs out with. People certainly aren't making friends at church, right? Like become. I feel like, especially in a place like San Francisco, that almost rises to the level of being like a niche interest. But I also think like people just don't make an effort to reach out to other people. Like
Bingo.
there's all these things you could say about like atomization and the commute and uh, family breakdown and identity breakdown, but also it's like people are flaky and they are like, yeah, I met some girl or some guy or whatever that I liked and I want to be friends with, and I texted them once and then I never reached out again and I don't really know why I never reached out again,
Mm,
and that's a big problem.
mm. See, this gets very fascinating. This gets into some interesting territory that I've put a lot of clinical attention into because I've talked to people about this who were embarrassed by these sorts of things happening, wondering what they did wrong. Because the more anxiously attached someone is, if they're dealing with anxious attachment, they typically kind of blame themselves for these kinds of things. And so, working through it with them and talking about it, I had to do a lot of obviously reflective, active listening, but it also sent me into wondering why this stuff is in itself. And so this typically happens with people that there's no, and this might sound dark. It's not intended to. Well, there's no real consequence or sort of community element where there's no shame for leaving someone hanging and there's no repercussions, right? You never see them again, and so there's no embarrassment or sort of consequence. And I don't mean it would have to be horrendous or public shaming or humiliation, right? Like some humiliation ritual. No, but even that element of, well, if I leave Bob hanging and I see him at such and such thing, like bowling league, right? Let's make it secular because I don't want to keep playing the church card. I mean, I'm from the South, so that's fresh in my mind, even though it's not as, I mean, the church is not as big a coherent agent anywhere really as much. So even in the South, but that element of like not having to maintain even the appearance of dependence, right? Dependability is what I mean. That seems to play into it too.
I mean, I think that's definitely right, but I think that's sort of like uh, because I mean, in my lifetime, um, there like I in my childhood, and this might have just been a consequence of like my own personal experience, but there were strong community bonds, and the gossip and the shame that comes from that I think there's a cultural memory of that, and people don't want that. Like it feels better in a sense, like, okay, yeah, if I fuck up, I could go off and be someone new. I mean, of course, you have the tension between you have no accountability for how you treat people person to person, and then you have all the accountability in the world with cancel culture, um, and and that's sort of like it kind of reminds me of like Amish shunning. It's sort of like a weird overcorrection, it feels like.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
it's weird to like be able to be canceled and also be able to ghost someone in the same culture, right? They feel like mechanisms of one another.
No, I think that that's an amazing insight for sure. It's like the ability to withhold something is a huge mechanism here, and that's something to go down that would be really really fascinating. The overcorrection element, I think, is a great way of putting it because there are such negatives associated with everyone being in your business. That is such an annoying thing. And so there's that enmeshment of a closed system. And then there's the diffusion that happens with a completely open system that has no corrective mechanism. And so we can go back to like cybernetic communications theory, which is how family therapy kind of started. That term cybernetics, meaning the way systems self-organize. And so when you have a closed system that gets these positive feedback loops, not positive in a good way, but additive, like accelerating gossip and tension, and then you get the diffuse systems where things aren't catching and someone doesn't reply and it just, the system kind of dissolves. It's like we're trying to navigate what to do next as a culture to create a system that's like has semi-permeable bonds, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think, I was just like tweeting about this actually. Like, it's not going to be today or tomorrow or even this decade, but we are going to see a sort of like backlash to this, and I think we're going to go back to a more traditional style of interacting with people. And then, what's going to happen is all the shame and all the gossip and all those checks and balances are going to come back, and it's not going to or at least like those checks and balances as we understood them maybe 20, 30 years ago are going to come back, and it's not going to be any more comfortable than what we have now.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about just choosing different elements of pain. A really lighthearted subject here. Um, so maybe I will pivot into some other stuff we want to discuss. So much good stuff we can get into. So you started this project of being the friend by default, someone who goes different places and meets people and whose DMs are always open. That was kind of the motto that I got from your Substack. So, however briefly or however long you want to discuss, feel free. But what brought that to a close? If that was something that was kind of a jarring experience that you just had to end the experiment.
Well, first of all, I think um, it was great because I really did make a lot of friends doing this way, and people who I hope will be lifelong friends. This is only like 18 months ago or something, so what wasn't that far in the past. But also one it it is it's a standard that I created for myself that is like totally unrealistic. Um, people aren't these endless wells of compassion, and that's not to say that like I was bothered by folks reaching out to me or something. I just like didn't have enough bandwidth to give that much attention to as many people who eventually, as eventually like were reaching out to me. And
Sure.
if I'm getting, let's just say for example, I get 50 DMs a day, and it's probably about 30 minutes to respond to each of them. I run out of time and I run out of steam, and then there's always going to be a a bunch of like not just one but like several people who get forgotten again and again and again. And some people just forget and they don't reach out again, and it's whatever. They probably, weren't too serious about it anyway, and it's fine. That's the internet. But then there's like a minority of people who really start to resent me. Um, and like the number of times I've been called like a grifter, or like, oh, your public persona doesn't match who you really are. Or just like all this anger. And yeah, it's like, what? Like, I I don't owe anyone anything. I, I was doing this for a little bit. It was fun and it was great, for the people it was great for. But like, I don't I, I don't need to open myself. I do, I don't believe in like victim blaming or whatever, but I do believe I was inviting a certain kind of criticism that was very toxic. And it's just like, all right, I'm sorry, like I didn't respond to your DM. Like there's nothing, it's not personal, but because I'm so open and because I will be so forthright about my feelings and about my life story, people do take it personal if I ignore them or if I miss their message. And it rarely is. It's just like you can only have so many connections going at a single time.
So when did you decide to end this? Was this recent?
I think like eh, around February it
Oh
started
wow,
to
okay.
get, yeah, it started uh February 2019. I mean, it dovetailed nicely with coronavirus, but
Oh,
it
so
was
last
just
year in
like,
2020 is when this happened. Okay.
oh yeah, so 2020,
No, no,
not
no,
20.
you're totally fine. You're totally fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So see, what's interesting is I didn't meet you until after then. I didn't start kind of networking with you. So I had still seen that you had the default wisdom Substack, which is still running, of course. And so that seems to be going kind of, you're still accepting questions and chatting with people about that then. So I had to kind of go back, and in researching looking in your Substack preparing for our interview, I saw, oh, okay, so this was something that was an IRL experiment turned into a newsletter, and there were different little permutations here that I wasn't even aware of that were beyond just your Substack and Twitter presence.
Yeah, I mean, I was meaning it was mostly in person. Like
Yeah.
I was, constantly going all around the bay, hanging out with folks. And yeah, I mean, it was really cool. At some point, I just started like collapsing events into one another. People could come, to Pagan Idol or whatever bar in San Francisco to hang out, or like I would go to other meetups and bring a whole group of people, and it was really fun. But yet, like I said, like I was just, I was hurting people's feelings, and it was just like completely not my intention. I think it just doesn't scale, I think, is the issue. Like you can't really have a social media presence that's around. I will listen to you at any time, or I will meet you in any place. It doesn't scale, and you end up blowing people off, and it has nothing to do with them. It's just like, some days you don't feel like it, or maybe you don't, have chemistry with someone, and and then you look like a hypocrite. But it's just sort of, you can't, gamify or commodify relationships in this way. It doesn't end well.
Well, yeah, there's a limit to what you can do, and you were doing that free of charge, right? Like you weren't a therapist, you weren't able to sustain yourself off doing that.
Right. And I mean, the other thing is, like, I don't want to mislead people either. I don't want people to think that I am a proxy therapist, or that, I'm selling some kind of product. So, I think it's just like more fair to everyone to just be like, all right, this is my username, but it's not like I can't realistically give um, a friendship to everyone. I can be kind and friendly, but I can't be anyone's friend just because they want to be friends.
I get that. I mean, look, even in the therapeutic profession, there are times when a therapist has to say this isn't my competency, or draw boundaries. And it's fascinating to see what was going on with your Twitter the past few days. I think someone submitted a suicide threat. And so this has happened before to any therapist who has any experience in the field long enough, where if you see somebody once a week or so, even, and then they're like, well, I need to see you more. It's like, well, my boundary is that I have a big caseload and I can't do that. And you can give all the reasons, and there's still maybe a response from some clients who have sometimes personality disorders of, well, that you should make the time, like that's on you, you need to do it, you're a helper, or don't you care about me, don't you how dare you, how can you say this, don't you care if I live or die? And so there's this kind of feedback loop of uh you put yourself out there as this and you're not helping me, and that's what an absolute ripoff. And so I was kind of getting a flavor of that. It seemed like what was going on in some recent tweets that you sent out. I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to sound flippant, or like these people, annoy me or anything, because they don't. And I understand, like, I do feel like it's a different situation when it happens to a therapist. I do feel like, I again, like,
Oh yeah.
not, I feel like I did to some extent invite it, which is why I'm like, I ended the the default friend experiment, like, firmly, like, I'm sorry, I fucked up. Um,
Sorry, I tried
it,
to help. Bye.
um, it's been happening. I get called a fraud all the time, and I mean, all I can say to people is, I'm not a therapist. I can't be responsible for your life. I don't have the training. It's not only is it illegal for me to pretend like I have that expertise, if you're sending me an anonymous message, I don't know you. I can't help. It's mediated by the internet, and there's just there I run up against a wall, and people get very angry because I think for some people, maybe like, not just me, but anyone who has a social media presence, is like it's like a last ditch effort, and they feel like, well, if I can't even get this, like, then what can I get? And I feel for them. There there is a lot of loneliness, but there's nothing I can do to help, especially to someone who, it's like, not only is there the wall of the internet, but it's like they're sending me messages anonymously, and I'm getting hundreds of them, and then I have to figure out, well, which one belongs to who, and sort of read minds. um I believe the person who sent that message was in a very, was in a place of pain and like was very hurt. But I don't, like I said, I don't know them. I don't know what could I do? I just don't. I'm not a therapist, and I also like I have this natural limitation.
Well, it's very interesting to hear you say all that, because the first thing that comes to my mind when someone says default friend or offers kind of a friend experiment is it's just that. So friends have boundaries. It's not a professional who has a set time to see you every week or every other week or whatever. And you didn't bill yourself as a friendship coach or whatever. Everybody's a coach now, right? I don't know if you're
Right.
aware of that, but everyone who could put together five triple spaced, size 20 font, 3-page PDFs is a coach now on Twitter. So that's lovely to wade through all that. But you didn't position yourself as that. And so if someone, like you can see, and this gets very psychoanalytic, people will act out their drama upon you in ways when there's emotion involved that you can begin to see typically what they've done to other people. And so sometimes people will talk to either therapists or you, apparently anyone who positions themselves as a listening ear and someone who's empathic in some regard. I'm not going to say empath because that word has been really muddied as well, and that's a whole different side note. But anyone who positions himself as kind of a safe harbor and a confessional gets this sort of treatment where like you can get idealized as this lightning rod of positive affect. And when you don't live up to the idealization, there's this wrath, and that's a real hallmark of borderline personality disorder. Let me clarify and give a disclaimer. I'm not diagnosing anyone off of one damn tweet or something like that. But what I will say is that if you hear kind of a sad story from someone and it seems like they're just have not a friend in the world, and then when you mess up one day and forget something and that you erupt with this sort of wrath, you can kind of tell yourself, all right, so I'm seeing something that may be a pattern. This might be an alienation factor that caused this person to maybe not have any friends or not be the best at cultivating relationships, right? And so you begin to see that, and it sounds like that's kind of what happened, where you were having people who really potentially need help, but when you had human limitations, there was this inordinately angry response for someone they towards someone they never met.
Yeah, I mean, I I don't know what to do in that situation though, right? Like because I've found that apologizing, I feel like is the only solution. Like it is only the solution when you've truly fucked up, or it's like
Sure.
person to person, like that's apologies seem to just fall flat unless it's like a real conflict where like both parties have skin in the game. But I mean, apologies don't work. Ignoring it doesn't work. Uh, defending yourself certainly doesn't work. I mean, there's just when you encounter someone like that, it's. I mean, and some people just don't, won't let it go. I mean, I don't. I hope I don't encounter anything like that again or like that kind of anger. But I just don't. I don't know how to deal with it, and that's why I am very clear now. Like I that look, I'm not perfect and I don't want people to be under the impression that I can offer something that I can't. And I feel like maybe even a little bit self-deprecating just to be like, underline bold, like I'm sorry if I gave this impression in the past.
Yeah, sure. No, I think you're onto something huge. I think it's a very high level emotional awareness that to apologize and you're accepting someone else's frame, right? To basically say, you're right, I did this. It was a fuck up. It's like, well, I have a backlog of people sending me something, sending me different DMs about various topics, and I can tell that this was frustrating to you. Here are some resources that you can pursue. I think people need to be aware that there are free therapeutic resources out there. If someone has no health insurance and they make sufficiently little money, they would qualify for indigent level therapy at a community mental health center. And a lot of therapists, like when I was getting my start, and up until pretty recently, I worked alongside an agency, and people could get really reduced cost care. And so that is an option, right? People don't know that. So I've seen that crisis lines have been making the rounds on Twitter for a few years, and I think that's great. I've seen it more and more. I've seen it increase, and that's great. But even beyond that, beyond having someone on a crisis line to talk to, which I've heard more or less better things about those. My own clients before had come to me and said they call a crisis line and were basically hung up on when they said they weren't suicidal at that moment, because some of the times the employees there are not trained therapeutically, and sometimes are basically told to get people to a point where they agree not to kill themselves and then disengage. And so that can be more or less done masterfully, as you might imagine. But uh, to bring it back, people can seek resources in their community. Like you can look up community mental health net and you can put your zip code right wherever you are in the US, and in other countries there's infrastructure for that as well. And so that might be a better option if someone is trying to rely on a Twitter personality who started out doing something and can't do that anymore. They might want to pivot to maybe, low cost options near them. And if you have the money for it, then obviously those things, you can go on Psychology Today and look for people who specialize in them. You can still do that with different levels of income, but I hear the complaint a lot of the time that therapy is expensive, and so there are solutions for that. So anyway, that was just my own little sidebar there for people. Like that is something for people to be aware of, that you don't just have to rely on talking to people in DMs for that therapeutic
Well, I
intervention.
mean, I think that's a good point, and I think that there isn't the right kind of awareness about therapy. I mean, this is sort of a whole other tangent. I think there's a lot of like weird class stuff tied up in therapy as well. But I do think that someone who is, and abstracting this a little bit, maybe not me, but like who's using any kind of parasocial relationship as a way to work out their own problems, they might not be receptive to s- to someone saying you should seek therapy, or like here are some resources that might help you. I can't be the one. I think if they're determined to channel their anger y- onto you, they're going to do it either way. And this could be like more or less problematic. It could just be like you get a bunch of like spam emails or something, but it could also, dovetail into like something totally different. We've all heard, all sorts of different kinds of horror stories about this. Um,
Like
I
stalking.
also, right, it
That,
could be
okay.
stalking. Yeah, I mean, who knows, right? I don't want to. Now I'm a little bit conscious. I don't want to again like vilify people who are feeling this kind of anger or this kind of pain,
Right.
but
You're coming
I
that way.
right. But it's just it's a hard situation for the person in pain. It's a hard situation for the person who ends up the canvas.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's literally transference in the psychoanalytic school of thought. Is you are the lightning rod of transference, that the canvas is a great way of putting that, upon which paint is being projected rather forcefully, it sounds like. So what I would say about that is, you're right. If someone has already emotionally locked on and are angry at you for something, that that might not diffuse it. But I was throwing that out there as more of a like, well, you've done your due diligence morally, and now you may have to say that politely and block. I hate to say it, but look, there's no legal, like, you haven't promised any legal restorative curative technique or methodology here. You're someone who was running a friendship effort. And I don't know if you've ever seen the Reddit choosing beggars, where people will like just spit in the face of like a free cup of coffee. Like there's an offer from Dunkin' Donuts or something. Do you know what I'm talking about at all? That subreddit.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds familiar.
Well, it's this idea. It's interesting because I've seen on there companies were willing to give away a cup of coffee or a meal on certain promotional days, and then people would screen cap, they would screen grab like responses on Facebook, like, "What about gluten-free options? Shame on you. What is selfish company?" It's like companies giving away something, and the response is, "It wasn't what I wanted. Screw you." It's like, well, okay, that's very interesting, and I get it, but it's such a "I am the center of the universe" attitude, right? There's a rampant anger, the narcissistic entitlement there, and I mean, it's hard to it it's hard to believe that to start with whoever's mad at you about that. It seems like they would have some real long-standing issues, and that's why I think psychotherapy would be more apt than talking to someone online in a parasocial relationship. But you're right, sometimes people don't respond well to that, and I think that goes on to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. And this is a long ass conversation, but why people hate therapy. And this is very big, and it's very fascinating for me to deal with, because a lot of the people who I get along with, a lot of intellectuals, and the therapeutic world now is often seen as anything but, for a multitude of sort of confluences and factors. But that's a whole different thing. I'd love to explore that with you, and I also want to hear more of your life story for listeners because I've seen bits and pieces on Twitter, but never the whole thing. So wherever we want to fork off in that conversation.
Um, I mean, I think that therapy has sort of become a symbol of a certain lifestyle that people resent. Um, and I think there's all sorts of weird, like ripple effects to this.
Okay.
Um, I think it's very obvious to me when I'm talking to someone who has been like over therapized, for lack of a better term. They're using like workbook language, and they're a little bit too careful. They're a little bit too disconnected from their feelings. They're a little bit too clinical. And I think that it's difficult to be in a relationship with someone like that. On the other hand, I understand why that happens, right? Like if you grew up in a home where you're constantly being interrupted or you're being silenced in some other way, and the only way to get your point across is to remove the emotion and to just be, this is, I'm coming to you with who I am, what I need, and why I need it. And that it's just hard when you're sort of bringing that to other relationships. Um, I also think like go to therapy can be a very dismissive thing. People think that you're pathologizing a normal reaction. I think a lot of people like confuse like, okay, this needs to be talked about with a therapist, and okay, you're screaming at me or you're crying or whatever, but there was a clear external stimulus, and like, anyone would cry, or like that you're processing the situation in this way makes total sense. It's just uncomfortable for you and it's uncomfortable for me in this moment. So maybe a little bit of it is people are trying to be armchair psychologists themselves, and that can be extremely grating.
Hmm. Lots of food for thought there. Um, so sort of intellectual and pseudo intellectual Twitter, and lots of people who follow me and that I follow have been talking about this element of. So there was a tweet that went viral, and it was semi-viral. I don't know how many retweets it freaking got, but it was this: men will do blank instead of going to therapy. And I think the place in which that tweet came from is what triggered, I'm using a therapy term, a lot of anger. And I think the just like you said, that's why I'm thinking of this tweet in particular, is you just said that the dismissive function of that statement of go get help, go to therapy, plays into it a lot. And also the sort of therapeutic milieu that we're having now, it's a very interesting thing because throughout medicine, throughout the history of medical science, from the Hippocratic Oath onward, there's been a unifying ethos of do no harm and heal through sound science. Okay. And so, but throughout the psychotherapeutic field, it has not been such. It began arguably in ancient Greek times, even in Aristotelian times, when looking at the different elements of the personality, analyzing it, like will, passion, ethics, all of these things. If you want to be very general with your definition, if you want to be more specific, it obviously began with Freud and Wilhelm Reich and different actual psychologists. And well, actually, Freud was a neurologist by trade, so that's a whole different thing. But so he was even more on the medical side. But it started with a bunch of men, Anglo-Saxon to be particular, pathologizing emotional dependency and histrionics. And it started out in a very, and I use this word seriously, misogynistic place. Now, Freud has some pretty damn good ideas. And his daughter, Anna Freud, is an unsung hero because she named all the defense mechanisms, essentially. People don't know that. So I want to give her a shout out. But it's transformed from that into almost the polar opposite of color in a coloring book, name your emotions, yay, we're adulting. It's very fascinating to watch that. Like if medicine did that, we would, well, for one thing, people would be dead. But for another thing, it would like there would be more attention drawn to it, I think. But a lot of the people who hate therapy hate it, I believe. One of the reasons, and you can kind of tell me what you think about it, is just the live, laugh, love revolution of leading with your vulnerabilities and trying to safety proof the world versus it being this grit accumulating process of desensitization. There's all of these elements that people hate that they think is just the therapeutic realm. And it's really just a modern movement and moment in therapy.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point here with the misogyny. I do think, and I don't feel comfortable say, broad strokes saying this is true in real life, but on Twitter, certainly, right? Like there is this sort of dismissal of men, and men do feel like, um, they're being not only minimized, but like constantly emasculated. And there's all sorts of anger that is very, very visible on Twitter. So, um, therapy being this very feminine thing, or, so it seems, right, is going to be very, it's, of course, that's going to touch a nerve, right? Like, I feel like, the conversation is, I don't like therapy, or, men will do this instead of go to therapy. But the underlying conversation is like, women are now, able to, like there's this man versus woman thing that is so, it's so much deeper than just the therapy issue. I feel like the men who got angriest at that just felt like one, it's just one more expression of their complaints being dismissed. As far as the live laugh love thing though, I mean, i I think there's like a real misunderstanding of where that comes from. And that I think that the difference between the way the self-help movement was taken in by corporate culture and just perverted in this, weird way, and how that's always worked. And then people who have real personality disorders, real trauma, real maybe like issues with their brain chemistry. And then I think there's even a third group of people who have like these maladaptive, emotional regulation issues, and it's a response to their environment, not trauma per se, or not abuse, but like, all right, like let's look at your life. You work 10 hours a day, you commute another hour, and you get no direct sunlight, and all you eat are bagels or something. Like that's going to affect your responses to things too. And that person needs a therapist to mediate that pain is like a whole other frustration and issue.
Absolutely, all of that is so relevant. If you're living, so there's the McMindfulness culture of using mindfulness as, it's interesting because this gets into such a Deleuzian framework of the machines of capture and of mindfulness training being what John Kabat-Zinn studied and really streamlined, which comes from Buddhist practice and other things. I'm not at all minimizing Kabat-Zinn's packet research in it. He really studied ancient wisdom in a controlled setting. But then that was a kind of revolutionary moment in therapy, and realizing that mindfulness is just such a huge component of well-being, and the ability to be present minded and content. And this gets into, by the way, uh, this gets into the idea of contentedness, by the way, and your whole concept of optimization and how many options are good and what is that. It's really the idea that we have to determine what we're content with, rather than it could we get one little bit better, and is it worth destroying relationships to have one little tiny iota more? Well, compared to what? So anyway, um, but the idea of men and misunderstanding therapy or being beaten over the head with it is an important topic that I try to engage with often when I can on Twitter, because we know that men have attended college in lower numbers recently and are dropping out of the workforce and education. And so I have a heart for that. And I want to determine what we can do as professionals, especially as male professionals, to help our fellow man, literally, and obviously women, because this comes into play as well. The women in men's lives finding out, like, well, my husband's depressed, or my boyfriend or my brother, right? Depressed but won't get help. It's like, well, what does help look like to him? And does he think he's going to be penalized for being a man? It's like, aha, okay. Well, I've ended up getting having female clients pull their husband onto a Zoom call when COVID was going on. I was still at the agency setting, and be like, listen to Jeremy explain EMDR and trauma therapy. Listen to this. Now explain it. Say, look, here's what this is. We're not going to penalize you for stuff, and you don't have to reveal all your emotions. It still works, you know? So, all of that is so valuable. And the theme is nuance matters. And I mean, I think that's great. Well, you have a Substack for that, because you can say stuff that's longer than a tweet, right?
Yeah, I mean, I understand why, why nuance has been lost, especially like, how did you put it? Like big mindfulness. I think that's a great way to put it. You touched on something interesting there too. I mean, this optionality thing that I keep seeing the phrase, "We worship at the altar of choice." You, over and like it's weird because I see it in all of my sort of Twitter spheres. I see it on tech Twitter. I see it sort of on the more political Twitter, and there's like a real sort of suspicion of that. Um, and it's so weird to me that people are think that we're in a crisis of unlimited optionality when I think we're really in a crisis of never ending optimization, which is I think an important distinction, right? It's like you don't it's not keeping the door open to move to Paris or Berlin because for the sake of it. It's because one might be better, and that it's about like which one is better and which one's best and how do I self-actualize, and everything's about self-actualization without any kind of system around it is the issue. Not that you want to have people don't want every possible experience. If it was unlimited optionality to take the cities thing, people would be like moving to Detroit and trying out like Western Alaska, right? It isn't about experiencing everything you can experience under the sun. It's about how can I be the best version of myself, which I think can be super toxic.
Yes. I think, well, and it's because, and I'm not anti-business completely. I'm anti-crony capitalism, but I think there's just such a cottage industry, such a glut, a surplus of people willing to take your money to show you that you could have more. I don't know. Have you seen the new Wonder Woman movie?
Oh, I don't. I've tried to watch superhero movies, but my brain just shuts off. Like I almost want to ask someone. I fall asleep. Like I can't focus
Yeah.
on it at all.
There's an insipidness to a lot of popular media, but I will say, so in the Wonder Woman movie, the main villain is an 80s, um we would say like a yuppie icon telesalesman, like a televangelist but secular, and his motto is life is good but it could be better. And so that's such a fascinating unfalsifiable claim, right? So anyway, we're running out of time here. We need to do a part two. This is a good teaser here for going to that conversation, but there's so much to explore on being hooked into buying things and having your paradigm put in terms of optimization, because the engines of that, whether it's online dating or other things before that even, are priming you for that. So
Yeah, I mean, this is that I would love to do a part two. This has been a great conversation.
thanks. I think podcasting and videos are a great way to get a lot of content out, and it's such a short amount of time compared to typing. I mean, I type at rapid pace, but on the phone, it freaking so small, even with the big iPhone. But anyway, yeah. Anyway, tell listeners what you work. So you're working on fiction right now, and if they want to find that, they can go in your Substack. We'll link all that in the video, but hit on what you're excited for here.
Sure. So I have a Substack where I'll like, muse on whatever. I also have some fiction there. And then of course the advice column. So if you want to send in a question, yeah, just shoot me an email address, and it's shoot me an email address. Shoot me an email, and the address is on defaultfriend.substack.com.
All right. Thank you so much, DF.
Bye.